Hello, I'm so glad you are here. Today's story is about Luther Mays and his twins boys. John and James is living their best life until the ex-wife Jennifer returns and tries to divide the family for her own selfish reason. My question to you, after years of being gone, does the mother have a right to be in the boy's life? Let us know your thoughts, yes or no. Luther Mays adjusted his tie in the hallway mirror, glancing over his shoulder to check on his twin boys, John and James, who were racing toy cars across the living room floor. A smile tugged at his lips as he watched them, their laughter filling the spacious sunlit apartment. At just 5 years old, the boys were bursting with energy and curiosity. Despite their identical appearance, blonde curls, dimpled cheeks, and wide, mischievous grins, their personalities couldn't be more different. John was the thoughtful, observant one, always cautious before acting, while James dove headfirst into every adventure, often dragging his brother along for the ride. It had been nearly 4 years since Jennifer left. Luther remembered the day all too well, the quiet resignation in her eyes as she packed her bags and whispered goodbye to their sleeping sons. At just 18 months old, John and James had been too young to understand the sudden absence of their mother. Luther had thrown himself into fatherhood, determined to give his boys the love and stability they deserved. His work as a private investor, helping new startups take off, allowed him the flexibility to be there for them. When he traveled for business, he made it a rule to take the twins along, immersing them in new places and cultures, while keeping their worlds stable. Wealth wasn't something Luther flaunted. Coming from a family of considerable means, he knew the pitfalls of raising children in privilege. He wanted his sons to grow up grounded, valuing hard work and kindness over money. They lived comfortably but humbly, blending into the vibrant community around them. Luther signed them up for soccer leagues and art classes, taking them to public parks rather than private clubs. They volunteered at local shelters, feeding the homeless or sorting donations. He wanted the twins to see life in all its diversity and complexity. Today, the plan was to visit the community garden a few blocks away. The boys had been studying plants in kindergarten, and Luther thought it would be a great way for them to see nature up close. Plus, he could use a bit of green therapy himself after a week filled with late-night calls and financial projections. "Guys, shoes on. We're heading out in 5, Luther called, grabbing his jacket from the coat rack. John immediately went to fetch his sneakers, while James hopped around on one foot, trying to wrestle his shoes on without breaking his momentum. Luther couldn't help but chuckle, shaking his head as he bent down to help. Once they were ready, they headed out, John carefully holding Luther's hand while James charged ahead, waving his toy car like a flag of victory. As they walked, Luther couldn't help but feel a pang of pride. Despite the challenges of single parenthood, his boys were thriving, full of love and life. He hoped the garden trip would be another memory to add to their growing collection of adventures. The community garden was a hidden gem, nestled between 2 apartment complexes, bursting with rows of bright flowers, towering sunflowers, and tidy vegetable patches. The air was crisp with the scent of soil and blooming lavender. John's eyes widened in fascination, while James immediately sprinted toward a patch of marigolds, pointing at the fluttering butterflies. Luther guided them to the central pathway, greeting a few familiar faces as they passed. One of the volunteers, a cheerful elderly man named Bill, waved them over. "Luther, boys, good to see you out here. The tomatoes are just coming in." John was already kneeling by a row of cherry tomatoes, gently touching the vibrant red fruit. "Are these ready to eat?" he asked, his voice cautious but intrigued. "Almost," Bill chuckled. "A few more days of sun." James, meanwhile, was darting from plant to plant, exclaiming over every beetle, bee, and brightly colored flower. In his excitement, he didn't see the young woman crouched by the herb bed until it was too late. With a thud, James collided with Annie, who yelped as she toppled backward, twisting her ankle awkwardly. John gasped, rushing to her side, while James froze, his eyes wide with guilt. Luther hurried over, kneeling beside Annie. "Are you all right?" "I'm so sorry," he said, concern lining his face. Annie grimaced but tried to smile. "I'm fine, just didn't see him coming." James looked like he was about to cry. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to," Annie chucked, saying, "It's okay, really? Just a little tumble." But when she tried to stand, her face paled and she quickly sank back down. Luther glanced at her ankle, noticing the swelling. "That looks bad. Let's get you to the clinic." He carefully lifted her, nodding to Bill. "I'll take her to St. Mark's." Bill waved them off. "Of course, go on." John tugged at Luther's sleeve. "Is she going to be okay, Dad?" Luther gave him a reassuring smile. "She'll be fine, buddy. We just need to make sure her ankle is all right." With Annie in his arms and the boys trailing behind, Luther couldn't help but feel a surge of protectiveness. Little did he know, this unexpected encounter would soon change all their lives. The clinic was bustling with the usual Saturday crowd. Luther carefully set Annie down in a plastic chair near the reception desk, then knelt beside her, his hand lightly resting on her shoulder. "I'll handle the paperwork," he said gently. "Stay put." Annie nodded, wincing as she shifted her foot. John and James stood nearby, unusually quiet, their eyes darting between their dad and Annie. Luther offered them a reassuring smile before heading to the reception to fill out the forms. While waiting to be seen, Annie tried to ease the boys' worries. "Hey," she whispered, smiling through the pain. "You guys like pancakes?" James's face lit up. "Yeah, Dad makes the best ones." John nodded vigorously, "with blueberries and whipped cream." Annie chuckled softly. "Sounds delicious. Maybe you can teach me sometime." When the nurse finally called her name, Luther helped her into the examination room, where the doctor examined her ankle. A mild sprain, the doctor concluded, prescribing rest, ice, and some pain medication. Luther promised to make sure she got home safely. Back at the waiting area, Luther knelt by the boys. "We're gonna take Annie home and make sure she's okay." James looked relieved. "Can we make her pancakes?" Luther laughed softly. "I think that sounds like a great idea." As Luther drove Annie home, the soft hum of the engine seemed to lull her into a peaceful sleep. Glancing in the rearview mirror, he saw her head leaning against the window, eyes closed, breathing steady. The boys sat quietly for once, sensing the need to be calm. James whispered to John, his little hands fiddling with his toy car. When they arrived at Annie's small apartment building, Luther gently nudged her shoulder. "Annie, we're here." She stirred but didn't fully wake, the medication clearly taking effect. Luther hesitated, then carefully unbuckled her seatbelt and lifted her out of the car, trying not to disturb her. John held the door open, his small hands gripping the handle tightly. Inside the apartment, he laid her on the couch, propping a pillow under her head. The boys looked around curiously. It was a cozy, art-filled space with vibrant paintings on the walls and plants in every corner. "Dad," John whispered, tugging on Luther's sleeve. "Can we stay and make sure she's okay?" Luther glanced at Annie, then back at his sons. Couldn't bring himself to leave her alone, especially when she was in pain and drowsy from the meds. "Yeah, bud, we'll stay. Let's make ourselves comfortable." While Annie slept, the boys busied themselves in the living room, building a makeshift fort from cushions and whispering stories about brave knights and enchanted gardens. Luther found a spare blanket and gently draped it over Annie, then sat on the armchair, keeping a watchful eye on both her and the twins. The night passed quietly, punctuated by the boys' giggles and whispered stories. At some point, they dozed off in their fort, the toy car still clutched in James's hand. Luther barely slept, his mind lingering on the unexpected warmth he felt in Annie's presence, and the odd sense of home that had settled over them. In the morning, sunlight streamed through the sheer curtains, pooling on the wooden floor. Annie stirred, the scent of something sweet and warm filling the room. Slowly, she opened her eyes, disoriented at first. Then she heard it, a soft sizzle and the unmistakable smell of blueberry pancakes. She sat up gingerly, spotting Luther in the small kitchen, flipping pancakes with surprising ease. The boys sat at the tiny dining table, snickering as James tried to stack syrup bottles like building blocks. Luther turned and smiled at her. "Morning, hope you're hungry." The boys insisted on pancakes. A soft smile spread across Annie's face, her heart unexpectedly full. "Smells amazing," she whispered. Luther placed a plate in front of her, topped with a perfectly golden pancake, blueberries peeking through. James grinned, pointing proudly. "I helped." "I can tell," Annie said with a grin, grateful beyond words. It wasn't the breakfast she expected, but it was undeniably the best morning she'd had in a long time. Just as Luther finished plating the last batch of pancakes, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed from the hallway. A soft knock on the door followed, and before Luther could react, the door swung open, revealing a petite woman with graying auburn hair and kind, inquisitive eyes. Marilyn, Annie's mother, stepped inside, her mouth dropping open in surprise at the sight before her. "Annie?" Marilyn called cautiously, her gaze shifting between the handsome man in the kitchen and the two boys chattering at the table. Annie, still seated and a bit dazed from sleep, managed to smile. "Mom, it's okay. This is Luther and his boys, John and James. They helped me out last night." Marilyn blinked, trying to process the scene. Her natural instincts as an elementary school teacher kicked in as she approached the twins with a warm smile. "Well, hello there. Are you two helping out in the kitchen this morning?" James grinned proudly. "I helped make pancakes." John nodded, a little shyly. "We didn't want Annie to be alone." Marilyn knelt down to their level, her tone gentle and encouraging. "That's very thoughtful of you both. I bet those pancakes are delicious. You know, when I teach my students how to cook, we always talk about being careful with measurements. Did you boys help measure the ingredients?" James nodded excitedly. "Dad let me scoop the flour." Marilyn chuckled softly, glancing up at Luther with a mix of curiosity and approval. "Well, it sounds like you're raising two little chefs here." Luther smiled, rubbing the back of his neck. "They love being involved, sometimes a little too much." Marilyn couldn't help but notice how naturally the boys seemed to fit into her daughter's space, and how easily Luther moved around the kitchen, as if he belonged there. A faint, pleased smile formed on her lips as she joined Annie at the table, feeling a little more at ease now. "I'm just glad you're all right," Marilyn said to Annie, her voice softening. "And it seems you had quite the adventure." Annie looked at Luther, cheeks warming. "Yeah, an unexpected one." Over the next few days, Luther made a habit of stopping by Annie's place after dropping the boys off at school. Each morning, he'd arrive with a bag of groceries, determined to make sure she had a proper breakfast. Annie protested at first, insisting she could manage on her own, but Luther's gentle persistence wore down her resistance. Soon, it became their little routine. He'd make coffee while she leaned on the counter, sharing stories from her childhood or talking about her latest art projects. One morning, as he handed her a plate of scrambled eggs and toast, she looked at him with a hint of wonder. "You don't have to keep doing this, you know." Luther just smiled. "I know, but I want to." In the evenings, once school was out and work emails had slowed, Luther would return with the twins. John would proudly announce their school adventures, while James dug through Annie's art supplies, eager to create masterpieces to hang on her fridge. Dinner became a lively event. Annie learning that Luther had a knack for simple, hearty meals, and the boys constantly challenging each other to eat more vegetables. One evening, as they sat around the small dining table, James whispered to Annie, his voice full of innocence, "Dad says we're helping you get better. Are we?" Annie's heart melted. She reached out to ruffle his curls. "You boys are definitely helping. A lot." John chimed in, his face serious. "Dad says when someone's hurt, you have to take care of them." Luther glanced over, his eyes meeting Annie's. For a moment, the air felt charged with something unspoken, a warmth that had been steadily growing between them. Annie looked away, focusing on her food, her cheeks pink. Later that night, after the boys had fallen asleep on the couch during a movie, Luther carefully lifted them, tucking them into the makeshift bed he'd set up. As he straightened up, he caught Annie's gaze, a soft smile on her face. "You really didn't have to do all this," she whispered. Luther shrugged, his own smile gentle. "Maybe I didn't have to, but I wanted to." After a few weeks of care and rest, Annie's ankle had finally healed, and she could move around without discomfort. The boys celebrated her recovery with homemade cards and a small dance party in the living room, much to Annie's amusement. One afternoon, while the boys and Annie was busy at the kitchen table coloring, Luther took a chance. "Marilyn, I was wondering if you'd be able to watch the boys one evening. I was hoping to take Annie out for dinner." Marilyn's eyes lit up, clearly pleased. "Of course, they're great company. I'll keep them entertained." That evening, after dropping off the boys at Marilyn's, Luther took Annie to a small, cozy bistro not far from her place. The candlelight flickered between them, and after ordering, Luther decided to share a piece of his past. "I wanted you to know," he began, his voice low and thoughtful. "Jennifer left when the boys were just babies. She didn't want to be a mother. It's something I've come to terms with, but I didn't want you to think it was just some storybook breakup." Annie reached across the table, her hand lightly resting on his. "I can't imagine how hard that must have been. You've done such a wonderful job with the boys." Luther gave a grateful smile, but before he could respond, Annie spoke up. I understand about loss, in a different way. I was engaged once, not because I was madly in love, but because my dad was dying of cancer. He wanted to see me settled, and I wanted to make him happy. After he passed, I couldn't go through with it. I broke it off. They sat in a comfortable silence, both absorbing the weight of the past. Luther squeezed her hand gently. Sometimes the choices we make out of love are the hardest ones to live with. Annie nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel the ache of that memory, just a quiet understanding, softened by Luther's presence. By the end of the night, as they walked back to Annie's apartment, there was a new sense of closeness between them, forged through honesty and the willingness to share their stories. Luther was in the middle of making breakfast when his phone buzzed on the counter. He glanced at the screen, his stomach dropping when he saw the name, Jennifer. For a moment, he hesitated before swiping to answer. "Hello?" "Luther." Jennifer's voice was smooth, almost casual. "I'm in town. We need to talk." He kept his tone even. "About what?" "The boys," she replied. "I'm at the cafe on Maple. Meet me in 20 minutes. Before he could respond, the line went dead. Luther exhaled, gripping the phone tighter than necessary. After making sure the boys were settled with a craft project in the living room, he called Annie to come over and keep an eye on them. He didn't want them overhearing any part of this conversation. When Luther arrived at the cafe, Jennifer was already there, dressed impeccably in a tailored beige coat, designer sunglasses perched on her head. She looked every bit the part of someone who hadn't faced the responsibilities she had abandoned. As he approached, she gave him a fleeting smile and gestured to the seat across from her. "You look good," Jennifer said, crossing her legs elegantly. Luther didn't reciprocate the compliment. "What's this about?" Jennifer took a sip of her latte before leaning forward. "I've been thinking, I want to see the boys." Luther's jaw tightened. "You haven't seen them in years. You barely even call." Her eyes narrowed. "I know, but I'm their mother. I have rights." "Rights you gave up when you left," Luther shot back, keeping his voice low and controlled. Jennifer didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. "You know, I could make things complicated for you. Joint custody isn't off the table." Luther felt a cold wave wash over him. "You've never wanted custody. Why now?" "People change," she said lightly, but Luther knew better. Something was driving this, but he couldn't pinpoint it. "You can't just show up after all this time and expect to be part of their lives like nothing happened," Luther replied firmly. "The boys have a stable life, and I'm not about to disrupt that." Jennifer smirked. "We'll see. I'll be in touch." Luther watched her leave, his mind racing. He needed to talk to the boys, but he didn't want to scare them. When he returned to Annie's, she could see the tension in his shoulders immediately. "What happened?" she asked, gently touching his arm. "Jennifer's back. She wants to see the boys. She mentioned joint custody." Annie's eyes widened. "Do you think she's serious?" "I don't know. But I have to prepare the boys. They know who she is. They've seen photos. But they only hear from her on their birthdays or Christmas. I didn't think they'd have to meet her anytime soon." Annie squeezed his hand. "I'll help you. We'll talk to them together." Later that evening, as the boys finished dinner, Luther called them to the couch. He took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "Hey guys, there's something important we need to talk about." John glanced up, his wide eyes curious. James continued to poke at his mashed potatoes. Luther knelt to their level. "You know how I've shown you pictures of your mom?" Both boys nodded, a little unsure. "Well," Luther continued, his voice soft but steady, "your mom is in town, and she wants to see you." James looked confused. "Why?" Luther hesitated. "Sometimes adults make choices that don't always make sense. Your mom hasn't been around much, but she wants to visit." John looked at Annie, his small hand finding hers. "Will you be there too?" Annie smiled warmly. "If you want me to be, of course." James shrugged. "Okay, I guess." Luther's heart ached at their nonchalance, knowing they didn't understand the weight of it all. He glanced at Annie, grateful for her steady presence. As he tucked the boys into bed later, he couldn't help but worry about the impact Jennifer's return might have. All he could do was hope that whatever came next, his sons would know that he was there for them. Always. Jennifer arrived at the park in heeled boots and a tailored jacket, clearly more suited for a gallery opening than a morning at the playground. As she approached the bench, where Luther and the twins were waiting, she plastered on a smile, though her discomfort was apparent. John and James, eager to finally meet their mother, ran up to her with hopeful smiles. "Hi," James chirped, holding out his hand. John hesitated, looking between Jennifer and his father, but managed a small wave. Jennifer knelt, attempting to appear engaged, but her smile faltered when James asked, "Are you gonna play with us? Dad usually plays tag." "Oh, Jennifer stammered, glancing down at her impractical footwear. "I didn't dress for running." The boys exchanged glances, clearly confused. Luther offered a quiet nod of encouragement, but Jennifer seemed more focused on keeping her coat clean than interacting with the twins. The boys tried to engage her, showing off their favorite spots in the park. John pointed out the jungle gym, while James insisted she watch him climb. Jennifer half-heartedly praised them, but her enthusiasm waned as they peppered her with questions. "Do you like pancakes? Dad makes them with blueberries," John asked. "Do you know how to play soccer? Dad taught us," James added. Jennifer's smile tightened. "That's nice," she replied, barely listening. The boys then mentioned Annie, their stories overflowing with excitement about art projects and bedtime stories. Each mention of Annie made Jennifer's jaw clench. She spotted Annie on a nearby bench, watching protectively, and felt an unexpected pang of jealousy. Her mood soured further when James blurted out, "Annie always plays with us. Do you like her?" Jennifer's eyes flashed. "She seems involved," she replied coolly. Luther caught the shift in Jennifer's demeanor and guided the boys toward the swings, giving Jennifer a moment to collect herself. Seething, Jennifer couldn't shake the feeling that Annie had somehow replaced her in the boys' lives. Watching Luther push the twins, his laughter ringing out, she couldn't ignore the sense that she was the outsider in this new family dynamic. In that moment, a plan formed. If she could make Annie look bad in Luther's eyes, stir some tension, maybe she could reclaim a bit of control. If Luther felt torn between his new life and her return, it would give her leverage. A slow, calculated smile spread across her lips as she considered how best to manipulate the situation to her advantage. Jennifer's frustration grew as she delved into Annie's life, hoping to find some scandalous detail that could fracture the bond between her and Luther. To Jennifer's dismay, Annie's life was surprisingly simple. She worked as a freelance artist, spent evenings volunteering at a community center, and had a small circle of close friends. Nothing about Annie screamed opportunist or social climber, and this only made Jennifer's irritation grow. Determined to take a more drastic approach, Jennifer contacted a local gossip columnist and fed them a story, spinning Annie as a gold digger who was exploiting Luther's wealth. She painted a picture of Annie as a manipulative woman who wormed her way into the lives of Luther and the twins, claiming she was only after his family's fortune. The next morning, the article hit the newsstands, and Luther's phone lit up with concerned messages from friends and business partners. Annie discovered the article while browsing her phone over breakfast. Her heart sank as she read the hurtful words. The betrayal cut deep, and she knew instantly that Jennifer was behind it. Her hands trembled as she called Luther to tell him. When he arrived at her apartment, his face was tight with tension. "I know it's not true," Luther assured her, reaching for her hand. "But people are talking, and it's already affecting business." Annie felt a mix of anger and sadness. "She's doing this because she thinks I'm replacing her. But why hurt the boys? Why make this ugly when they're just starting to get to know her?" Luther shook his head, his jaw clenched. "Because she doesn't care about the boys. She cares about control." Despite Luther's reassurances, the damage was done. Everywhere they went, Annie could feel eyes on her, whispering, wondering if there was any truth to the claims. Luther remained steadfast, but the strain was palpable. Annie couldn't help but feel guilty, even though she'd done nothing wrong. That evening, as they sat in Annie's living room, Luther pulled her close. "We'll get through this," he whispered. But in the quiet, Annie couldn't shake the feeling that Jennifer wasn't done with her schemes. For the first time since they'd grown close, a shadow of doubt hung over their happiness. Jennifer wasn't done. Frustrated that her initial plan hadn't driven a wedge between Luther and Annie, she concocted a more sinister scheme. With a few clicks, she created a fake social media profile under Annie's name, complete with carefully curated photos stolen from Annie's public art pages. She crafted posts that hinted at a life of luxury and manipulative intent, tagging Luther's name and his business connections. Jennifer made sure to include suggestive comments and captions that implied Annie was using Luther's wealth for her own gain. It didn't take long for the fake page to catch attention. Someone forwarded it to Annie's boss at the community art center, concerned that the content reflected poorly on their projects. The next day, Annie was called into a meeting and informed that she would be placed on suspension while they investigated the claims. Shocked and devastated, Annie tried to explain that it wasn't her page, but the damage was already done. Feeling overwhelmed, Annie called Luther, her voice shaking. "They suspended me from the art center. They think I've been using my position to gain favors through you." Luther was silent for a moment, his anger simmering. "This has to be Jennifer. I'll handle it." But Annie couldn't bear the thought of being the cause of more trouble. "Luther, I think I need some space. I can't keep dragging you and the boys into this." His heart sank. "Annie, don't say that. We're in this together." She wiped at her tears. "I know. I need to think." Luther didn't push, sensing her need to process everything. But as he hung up, his resolve hardened. Jennifer had gone too far. He wasn't going to let her destroy what they had built. Meanwhile, Annie sat alone in her apartment, staring at the blank canvas on her easel. Despite the chaos, she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't ready to give up on Luther or the boys. No matter how hard Jennifer tried to break them, Annie couldn't let go of the happiness she had found. Determined, she began sketching, letting the familiar strokes calm her mind and remind her of what truly mattered. Marilyn couldn't bear to see her daughter hurting. The thought of Annie being separated from Luther and the boys weighed heavily on her heart. Despite the warmth and joy that had blossomed when the little family came together, Jennifer's manipulations were pulling them apart. Marilyn knew that if something wasn't done soon, the family they had all come to cherish might unravel. One evening, after seeing Annie's tear-streaked face and the worry in Luther's eyes, Marilyn made a decision. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in years. Her heart pounded as it rang, but when a familiar voice answered, she took a steadying breath. "We need to talk. It's about the boys and Jennifer." A few days later, Jennifer received a summons to a meeting at Luther's family company. She arrived, expecting to confront Luther alone, but found herself seated across from not only him, but also the company lawyer and Marilyn. Jennifer's confident demeanor wavered as they laid out two options. Either she could work with them to establish a structured visitation plan with the boys that took their well-being into account, or she would face a legal challenge regarding custody, one backed by Luther's powerful family resources. Jennifer's face hardened, her frustration evident. "This is because of her," she spat, glaring at Marilyn. "That woman thinks she can take my place as their mother." Marilyn remained calm, meeting Jennifer's gaze with unwavering resolve. "Annie has done nothing but love and care for those boys when you chose to walk away. You can't just barge back in and tear their lives apart." Jennifer seethed, but the gravity of the situation sank in. For the first time, she realized that Marilyn, the boys' grandmother figure, and Luther's family were united in protecting the twins' stability and happiness. As the meeting continued, Jennifer's indignation slowly shifted to uncertainty, realizing that if she continued her reckless path, she might lose more than she anticipated. Jennifer was still fuming from the last meeting when she received another summons. This time, she arrived at the boardroom with a mixture of frustration and curiosity. As she stepped inside, her eyes widened in surprise. Seated at the long mahogany table was not just Marilyn, but also her father, Gabriel Wright, looking stern and composed. Jennifer couldn't help but let out a bitter laugh. "So you called my daddy on me," she sneered, trying to mask her unease with sarcasm. Gabriel's gaze remained firm. "Sit down, Jennifer. We need to talk." Reluctantly, Jennifer took a seat, her demeanor defensive. Gabriel looked at Marilyn, offering a small nod. "First, I want to apologize for my daughter's behavior," Gabriel began, his voice carrying both authority and regret. "I blame myself for how selfish she has become. I gave her everything, but I failed to teach her the value of family and accountability." Jennifer's face flushed with indignation. "You're taking her side now? Seriously?" Gabriel folded his hands on the table. "It's not about sides. It's about right and wrong. Marilyn sits on the board of our company as a major shareholder. She's been part of our business far longer than you realize. And there's more. Annie is the heir to Baldwin Industries, a conglomerate that owns companies worldwide. Jennifer's mouth fell open, stunned by the revelation. Annie? That can't be true. Gabriel's expression softened slightly. It is. And this whole mess you've created has impacted not just your reputation but the family's as well. Jennifer clenched her fists. You expect me to just back down? Gabriel's tone grew colder. You will publicly apologize for your behavior. You will make things right with Annie, Luther, and the boys. If you refuse, I will cut you off financially and remove you from my will. Furthermore, you will give Luther full custody of the twins. Jennifer's face twisted with disbelief. You can't do that. I can and I will, Gabriel replied sternly. You've crossed too many lines. It's time you face the consequences. You abandoned those boys when they needed you most. Now, you want to disrupt the life they've built just to satisfy your pride. I won't allow it. Jennifer's bravado crumbled, replaced by a flicker of desperation. Realizing her father's resolve, she felt trapped, caught between her own stubbornness and the very real threat of losing everything. For the first time, she understood that her manipulations had not just hurt Luther and Annie, but also alienated her from her own family. Luther and Annie walked into the conference room, just as Jennifer buried her face in her hands, tears streaming down her cheeks. She looked up at them briefly, before lowering her gaze, overwhelmed and defeated. Annie hesitated at the doorway, her eyes widening when she saw Gabriel Wright sitting at the table. Mr. Wright, Annie greeted, surprised. Gabriel looked up and offered a warm smile. Nice to see you again, Annie. Been a long time, he replied, his tone softer than it had been moments earlier. Luther glanced between them, clearly confused. You two know each other? Annie gave a small nod, taking a deep breath. Yes, I should have told you earlier. Gabriel Wright is, well, my godfather. My family has been connected with the Wrights for decades. I grew up around Gabriel. My parents were heavily involved in the Wright Industries board. When my father passed, Gabriel took me under his wing, but I didn't really embrace that world. I wanted to live a simpler life and focus on my art. Luther processed the information slowly, realizing that the woman he loved came from a background as influential as his own. A smile spread across his face, both surprised and relieved. So, all this time you've been part of something much bigger. Annie looked down, feeling a bit sheepish. I didn't think it mattered. I didn't want wealth or status to define me. I just wanted to live honestly. Gabriel gave Luther an approving nod. Annie's always been humble. That's why I've always respected her choices. Jennifer wiped her eyes, still visibly upset. So what now? Am I just supposed to vanish while she plays happy family with you and the boys? Luther's expression softened. Jennifer, it's not about replacing you. It's about stability for John and James. You have the chance to be part of their lives when you're truly ready to be a mother. But not like this. Not through manipulation and lies. Jennifer looked down, the weight of her father's words still heavy on her shoulders. Gabriel's voice was firm, but kinder this time. Jennifer, if you truly want to build a relationship with your sons, it has to come from the heart, not from pride or a desire to control. Luther stepped forward, his voice calm. We'll work something out, but you have to put the boys first. That's all I've ever wanted. Annie placed a gentle hand on Luther's arm, her presence grounding him. For the first time in a long while, Jennifer didn't respond with anger. She simply nodded, realizing that the battle she'd been fighting wasn't with Annie or even Luther, but with herself. That evening, after the tension of the day had eased, Luther, Annie, and the boys decided to go out for pizza. The cozy pizzeria buzzed with laughter and the scent of freshly baked crust. John and James, full of energy and excitement, chattered about their favorite toppings, while Luther and Annie shared a quiet smile over the boys' enthusiasm. Once they settled at a corner booth with a large pepperoni and cheese pizza steaming in the center, James looked up from his slice and asked, "Dad, will Annie be our mom?" Luther, caught off guard, almost choked on his soda. He glanced at Annie, unsure of how to respond. Annie stepped in with a gentle smile. "We're working toward that," she said, her voice soft and reassuring. "But we want to make sure everyone is comfortable and happy." James nodded, clearly satisfied with the answer, but then his eyes lit up. "When you and Dad get married, can I have a dog?" John, not to be outdone, chimed in with a hopeful expression. "Can we build a treehouse too?" Luther couldn't help but laugh, ruffling John's hair. "One thing at a time, guys." After a fun evening filled with laughter and way too much pizza, they finally returned home, the boys sleepy and content. Once the twins were tucked into bed, Luther and Annie sat on the living room sofa, the glow of the city lights filtering through the window. Luther leaned back, glancing at Annie with a playful smirk. "So, since your family apparently has more money than mine, does that make me the gold digger in this relationship?" Annie snorted, trying to stifle her laugh. "Maybe I should be worried about you after all." They both chuckled, the tension of the past few days finally melting away. Luther reached for Annie's hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. "No matter what happens, I'm just glad you're here." Annie squeezed his hand gently. "Me too." For the first time in a long while, everything felt right. The future seemed brighter, filled with hope and the promise of new beginnings. A few months passed, and life settled back into its familiar, comforting rhythm. Jennifer had respected the boundaries set during the last meeting, and the boys seemed happier and more secure than ever. The air was filled with laughter one sunny afternoon as Marilyn stood in the kitchen with John and James, helping them cut out cookie shapes. James looked up, his face dusted with flour. "Grandma Maryland," he began seriously, "we decided something." Maryland raised an eyebrow, amused. "Oh, what's that, sweetheart?" John chimed in, holding a star-shaped cookie cutter. "We want Annie to be our mom, and you can be our grandma." Maryland couldn't help but smile, her heart swelling with warmth. "That's a big decision," she said gently. "I think that's something you need to discuss with your dad." The twins didn't waste a moment, sprinting into the dining room where Luther and Annie were setting the table for dinner. "Dad," James shouted excitedly, "what are you waiting for? We want Annie to be our mom." Luther looked at Annie, a grin spreading across his face. Annie's eyes widened, caught off guard by the boys' enthusiasm. Luther knelt down to be eye level with the twins. "You really mean that?" he asked softly. John nodded with determination. "Yes, we love Annie." Luther took a deep breath and looked at Annie, his eyes full of affection. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a small velvet box and got down on one knee. Annie gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. "Annie," Luther began, his voice steady despite the excitement in the room, "you've become such an important part of our lives. You've shown me and the boys what it means to love without expectation. Will you marry me and be a part of our family?" Tears shimmered in Annie's eyes as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered, laughing through her happy tears. Luther slipped the ring onto her finger as the boys cheered, wrapping their arms around both of them in a giggling embrace. 6 months later, surrounded by family and friends, Luther and Annie exchanged vows in a small garden ceremony. The boys wore matching suits and couldn't stop grinning, thrilled to officially have Annie as their mom. As they danced under the fairy lights that evening, it was clear that the family had found its happy ending. Hope you enjoyed this heartwarming story by Green Tea Tale. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe. Thank you.